Okay, let's continue our read and commentary from the Nag Hammadi text. We're on video 5. This video covers part 2 of the Tripartite Tractate. In the previous video, we discussed the two orders of the Demiurge, who goes about to organize what's called the universal order or the universal system, what we sometimes refer to as the one world order. And the Demiurge goes about to do this through the two orders, the one order being of the dark and the other order being of the light. What you have to understand about the Demiurge is he's the god of good and evil. And the true Father in heaven is only the God of light. There is no evil in the true Father in heaven. It's Christ that came to show us the glory of the true Father that is full of light. The Demiurge, on the other hand, is half empty. He uses these two sides to balance, if you want to call it, as they say in Star Wars, the Force, balancing of the left and right path. The left and right path is the dualistic path in which we live in as human beings in this cosmos called the Kanoma. This realm continually is a pendulum which swings from discord back to harmony and peace, and then back to discord. It's a mechanism by which allows for opportunity to have a varied number of experiences. This is done through the process of generation, which is to say genetics or birthing process, by which the spirit is entrapped by the DNA in the genetic process, and then it goes back to death. So you have these two sides that are constantly dueling one another, and that's the two-order system. In the last video, we also briefly touched upon the three types of human beings, and so human beings come to this realm to experience those three types, and we're going to discuss that in part 3. It'll be brought up, possibly even part 2. We may briefly expand on it. The other topic we discussed was the understanding of what is the Logos exactly. Again, reiterating, the Logos is not an actual being or creature, but rather is an archetype that is existing through the true Father, through Christ, and also exists in Sophia along with the Demiurge. Logos essentially refers to the reasoning process by which one makes sense of or defines their universe, their definition of what is, and then takes that information of how they view their place in the universe, who they are in that universe, to create a belief system of governance over a body of self or others or people or groups of people, so forth and so on. In the case of God the Father in heaven, that Logos, part of God, which is one part of the totality of God, is also known as the Christ, who goes by many names. Christ being the Word, as it says in John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, so forth and so on. That refers to the rational, logical part of the way God the Father emanates truth. That's that Logos that is pure and full, coming from, streaming from, emanating from the Father, and is in all of us, that potential, also known as Gnosis. So Christ came to earth to bring about that in the beginning, let there be light. In other words, awareness or Gnosis or Logos. So that's why Christ is also sometimes not only referred to as the Son of God, but also the aeon known as faith, grace, salvation, and Logos or logic, but logic in the sense of the true Father's emanation of truth, as Christ continually talked about bringing truth to mankind. I tell you the truth. This is the truth that I bring you, and differentiates between the true Father in heaven, or the pleroma, versus the false father. And the false father is Yodaboth, which is also known as Samael or Saklos, also known as the Demiurge, who goes about and creates his logic in both light and truth, and also dark and falsity, or an illusion. So as a result, his truth is tainted and malformed. That is a type of Logos in and of itself. So if you want to understand the different forms of Logos and how they influence humanity, then go back and listen to the previous video that goes into extreme detail in the part 1 of the Tripartite Tractate. The final thing in which we hinted on the two types of creation, or manifestation, I should say, of humankind. And that is the emanation by the true Father, which allows us to carry the Gnosis into this cosmos, or this dark realm, also known as Malkuth. And then the creation, or formation, by the Demiurge in Genesis, the two types of creation, one being the creation of the beings in the likeness of the Father in heaven, being both of male and female, meaning a balancing, born with both the knowledge of good and evil, so that it has full understanding of what those both are. And that is the way in which those born under the light or the likeness of the Father, as it says in Genesis 1, let us go and make man in our image, them in the likeness of himself, male and female. Actually, the first creation, actually God emanated rather than created. And emanating is different from creating in that emanating is merely extending yourself and thereby manifesting a new expression of yourself, expressing a new part of yourself. So this is what God the true Father does. It emanates. It does not dominate. It does not judge. It does not hoard over or lord over humanity or its emanation. It merely allows for and encourages gnosis and truth. And then you have Yodaboth, or the demiurge, in this realm that uses judgment. Judgment, of course, meaning the left and right, right and wrong. And there is criticism and there is a checklist, much like Santa Claus, naughty or nice, heaven and hell. So it's the right and left path. The path to Christ is neither on the right or the left, but rather it's straight, which he talks about. It's the path that's narrow and straight, and few that find it. What you have usually are those that are either on the right side or the left side that war against each other. And this is a theme within humanity in all cultures, in all stories, and it's what's expected in movies, in struggles that everybody goes through. They have to face some type of dark path and overcome that darkness, or vice versa, the person turns from an innocent state to a more tainted place. And you go through an understanding of how they arrived there and an appreciation of that individual's own struggles. So that's what you have that culminated to set up the hierarchical system, and that's where you'll understand the pyramidal system that you see on the dollar bill and the all-seeing eye, which is the demiurge, and the one world system. And again, reiterating before we continue in this video on part 2, it is important to reiterate the one world order is not going to come in the form of a government. The one world order has always existed and will continue to exist. That organization is a hierarchical system with its number one primary goal to prevent humans from having gnosis and having that moment of truth, much in the movie Matrix, the Neo moment, the realization that the realm in which they are currently in is the false realm. It's an illusion. It's not real. The real realm from which everyone came is the pleroma. This is the realm of the kanoma. And so here it is that we come back to find our name again, so that we may have a free will to gather ourselves, to define for ourselves who we are freely and openly, as the true Father in heaven allowed Sophia that experience of godship, and thereby she birthed the demiurge, and everyone through that also brought with them the light of God. And therefore, everyone has the potential to be a son and daughter of God. So that's where we are. Now, those are important points to know, and if you're going to understand Gnosticism, so feel free to ask any questions that you might have if you need any clarification. So let's pick up on part 2, section 11, Tripartite Tractate. This section is titled The Creation of Material Humanity, and the key word here being material, and the second key word being creation. Now, again, the Father in heaven does not create so much as emanates. But when we see the word create, we can think of either emanating or we could think of also forming. And you're going to see the difference as you learn more and more the lingo of Gnostics. So here in part 2, we're talking about the material manifestation or formation of humanity and not so much emanation. So let's pick up. The matter which flows through its form is a cause by which the invisibility which exists through the powers for them all and for as they beget before them and destroy. Now there are quite a few words missing from here, so it's very difficult to make sense of exactly what's being said here, but essentially it's talking about that the matter is the essence of the material person, but it does not exist because of the matter, but rather it exists because of the invisible. So it says a cause by which the invisibility which exists through the powers. So the powers are probably referring to the true Father, and that everyone really is alive because of the light that's brought to us through Sophia and the true Father in Christ, not because of the material form. The material form has no principle by which it can sustain itself. There is no life force in the matter part of the human being. So that's really what is being suggested here. The thought which is set between those of the right and those of the left is a power of begetting. And this is where it picks up from the last part 1, continuation of discussion about the left-hand path and the right-hand path, the two orders. All those which the first ones will wish to make, so to speak, a projection of theirs, like a shadow cast from and following a body. Those things which are the roots of the visible creations, namely the entire preparation of the adornment of the images and representations and likenesses, have come into being because of those who need education and teaching and formation, so that the smallness might grow little by little as through a mirror image. For it was for this reason that he created mankind at the end, having first prepared and provided for him the things which he had created for his sake. So which one is it referring to? Is it referring to the demiurge, or is it referring to the true Father? The highest sense of the word is referring to the true Father, but it's being done through the demiurge, being done from the true Father, through the Christ, Sophia, and then the demiurge. So when it talks about the first part being the likeness, it's referring to the right-hand path that carries the light with them. So they carry that fire within them. That's why Lucifer is referred to as the light bearer. So he carries knowledge with him. These people have the potential for gnosis. The light is within them. They merely need to recognize that gnosis. So this is the right-hand path that's being referred to here. That is purposely set into place to have these two orders so that they can have potential to find that light, but to find it from a completely empty place, meaning at the most lowest level that you can go, so that when you go about and you find that light, you're doing it not by command or by order or because God the Father in heaven or in the pleroma demands you do it, and I demand your obedience, but because it allows you to do it freely and at your own pace and time and in your own way. So it allows for you to be completely emptied of any light other than that small light known as the gnosis. You will be set forth to freely find in your own time, way, and account. So it goes on. Like that of all else is the creation of mankind as well, that the spiritual Logos moved him invisibly as he perfected him through the demiurge and his angelic servants, who shared in the act of fashioning in multitudes when he took counsel with his archons. Like a shadow is earthly man, so that he might be like those who are cut off from the totalities. Also, he is something prepared by all of them, those of the right and those of the left, since each one in the orders gives a form to the blank, we don't know the word here, in which it exists. It might be something like the word, the domain in which they exist, perhaps. So what's being said here is that, again, just reiterating, the demiurge may think he's in charge because he blindly goes about and does this, but in all truth, it's the true Father in heaven that has allowed, or in the pleroma, that has allowed all of this to be, and to purposely allow for mankind to follow after the blueprint of the demiurge. Because again, you have to remember that the demiurge is the birth child of Sophia. So in other words, that's a concept she wanted to experience. So when she wanted to become as God, knowing the ineffable or the eternal, infinite, total mystery that can never be understood completely because it's infinite, she created an era in thinking. That era in thinking, because she's an aeon, created an entire universe, the Kanoma, by which we reside. God, the true Father, allowed that to be. By so doing, creating that realm known as the Kanoma, or the realm of the demiurge, or this cosmos, this universe, it allowed humankind to be separated from the light completely. Because in the beginning, before God created or emanated anything, and only God was in the pleroma, there was nothing but God in the pleroma, and God was totally alone. So in order for Sophia to truly appreciate what God is like and what God experienced prior to the creation, every human being, and through Sophia, must experience being alone. So that's why God is in the quiet places, in the silent places in between, and is not going to speak to humanity, so that man, not literally in the literal sense, or provide proof that, that God exists, but to allow human to have a light in them to always question toward that, so that they may experience their own will in their own time and their own individuality. For if God had already set everything into motion and allowed humans to just completely be gods already from the beginning, then they would be probably no less than or more than a mindless robot. Of course, God, with all great wisdom and totality, understood that humanity would only have will if it was completely emptied of light, of understanding of the universe and the mystery, the ineffable, and found its way back in its own unique way. That was the only way in which each human being can experience their unique selves and find their name. That's why it's always important and being brought up through the Gnostic text about the name and the name of God and the name of each one of us and us coming back to find our name, meaning to find who we are. And once we've completed the task of finding out who we are, each one of us individually, that's when we've fulfilled our mission here in this Kanoma. That's when we will be full and will have no more attachments to this realm. So there is nothing that you can do, and therefore you should have no shame or guilt or this false concept of sin that can force yourself back to the pleroma. Now, there are things you can do that will help you toward growing gnosis, and that light in you will help you to quicken your return to the pleroma. Because with gnosis comes a growing light within you. And when that light's full, that's when the pleroma can receive you, because it can only receive you in totality, because it is of its own kind. And there is no darkness, you see. There is no ignorance in that pleroma. And when we talk about Sophia asking or requesting of God the Father a totality of experience or the ineffable mystery, or to know what it's like to be God, we're not referring to Sophia having ignorance. When we talk about ignorance, we're talking about the word ignore. So when you ignore something, that's by which we get the word ignorance, to ignore, a state of ignorance, ignorance. So that means that you are ignoring truth. That's all that means. It does not mean that if you're in the pleroma and you don't have all knowledge, therefore you're ignorant. That's not what that means. The amount of knowledge you have is not equal the amount of ignorance you have. Ignorance refers to knowledge you have that's being ignored and being through distractions or detachments, so forth and so on. If everybody were to go into themselves, they would know the truth that already is there, but they're ignoring it. That's why Christ continually talks about or Paul talked about humans being purposely ignorant, you see. All right, so let's continue. The remaining of the Tripartite Tractate has quite a few words missing, but we're going to do the best we can to read this and comment and to clarify this as much as possible. So it says and again a word missing, which the Logos, who was defective, brought forth, who was in the sickness, did not resemble him, because he brought it forth forgetfully, ignorantly, and defectively, in all the other weak ways, although the Logos gave the first form through the demiurge out of ignorance, so that he would learn that the exalted one exists, and would know that he needs him. So this is not only to allow every human the experience of knowing God the Father in their own way, in their own time, and that in finding one's individual name and self. This being created in the form of the demiurge, meaning having also light and dark, being groping in the dark, so to speak, starting at that base form as a human, also helped humans recognize that they need God the Father in heaven, that he's the source of everything. And to imagine one can be separate and survive without God the Father is delusional. This is what the prophet called living spirit and breath of the exalted aeons and the invisible. And again, it's referring to the intelligent part of God that resides in everything and goes about and sustains the universe through its intelligence, through its gnosis, and that's the Logos. So that's just the intelligent part of God that governs everything through the principle of truth. That's what it's referring to. That sustains the universe, not the material physical realm that was formed and fashioned by the demiurge. And this is the living soul which has given life to the power which was dead at first, for that which is dead is ignorance. That ignorance, purposely ignoring the truth of that light, is what leads to death, because we attach to the physical things. And why does it lead to death? Because it is the mind, which is also known as the soul, that allows humankind to have a subconscious contract with their own will. Whatever you tell your mind, the universe will follow, and you also will follow. So if you are purposely remaining ignorant of that light, then the soul says, much like a computer program, okay, therefore that light doesn't exist. And it cannot use that light to sustain its body. So eventually, whatever light is there will dissipate through time, and the person will grow old and they will die. Now, in the last video, I talked about how the light is actually responsible for death. And let me clarify that, because I don't want anyone to misunderstand what mystery I was revealing, listener. And that is that if you are struggling against the light, I must clarify, that is what will create disease and illness and death. If you can align to the light and you follow the light, and meaning the gnosis, and you'll know the gnosis by what is going to promote life and is going to promote health and well-being, and the truth of the gnosis, or the knowing of the true pleroma versus the false illusion we live in, and you appreciate that and you know that, then that being in alignment with that light will actually assist you toward extending your physical life in this realm. And the reason is the light in you exists for one reason and one only. It exists to gather as much of remembrance of the gnosis and the grand knowledge as possible. And once that light recognizes that you have no more light to find, then it decides that your incarnation in this realm is done. So much like that saying that once you stop growing, then you start dying. That's pretty much the same thing here. So it continues, it is fitting that we explain about the soul of the first human being. Now, I want to clarify again, we continue the Gnostic text, you're going to come to understand that three parts of the human body there is, or the human being. There is the body, the physical body, there's the soul of the human being, and then there's the spirit of the human being. And the soul and the spirit are two different things. The body, the physical body, the flesh, the muscles, the bones, the organs, that is the body. The liquid part, the blood, and all of the other essential fluids in the body, that is the soul of the human being, including the water in the human being, and that's the purified water and the purified cell of the human being. And then finally, the spiritual part is the breath of that human being and the fire within, which is the gnosis. So now that soul is the bridge between the physical body and the spirit. That's the bridge. The soul is the bridge between the physical body and the spirit body of the human. That's why when Christ had the Last Supper, he talked about partaking of the leavened bread and the wine, because he was representing or symbolizing the body through the bread, which he said, this is my body, and then also the wine, and which is the blood, which he said, this is my blood, and partake of it and do this in remembrance of me. And the reason he's saying, do this in remembrance of me, he's saying you must consume the body and you must consume the blood, meaning you must bring it to an end. You must absorb it, that to an end. Bring it to an end. You must sacrifice, put aside the body and the blood and your attachment to it, so that the spirit can be liberated. So that's what's being referred to when Christ talked about the Last Supper and how that's significant. So it says, it is fitting that we explain about the soul of the first human being, that it is from the spiritual logos, while the Creator thinks that it is his, since it is from him, as from a mouth through which one breathes. The soul is in the blood of that fire part of you. So the fire part is both the gnosis mixed in with the physical part. That becomes the blood, you see. That's that fire in you. That's the soul. And you ever see that those people that looks like they're on fire when they're doing music and they're dancing, and maybe someone like James Brown, they say, wow, that guy's got a lot of soul, and it looks like he's on fire. He's on fire. You know, those things that humans say are not accidental, because they are the truest expression of what we're feeling on the inside, of something that we're seeing in our minds that symbolize something to us that seems to bring us closest to describing what we're experiencing and witnessing, perceiving before us. Yes, indeed, that person is on fire, and their soul's on fire. That person has a lot of soul, you see. The Creator also sent down souls from his substance, since he, too, has a power of procreation, because he is something which has come into being from the representation of the Father. Also, those of the left brought forth, as it were, men of their own, since they have the likeness of being. So the right-hand side is what brings about those of the light, or the light bearers, which we get Lucifer and we get the angels, and the people in the middle that have the knowledge of spiritual things, but they misuse it because their logos is not oriented to the pleroma, but it's oriented to the kanoma. And then you have the second order, which is the men of darkness, which is of the likeness of the demiurge, and not the likeness of the Father. So this is what it's talking about, the two orders. The spiritual substance is a single thing and a single representation, and its weakness is the determination in many forms. There is a predetermined or determined path by which the spirit is taking through the physical flesh. And that's what it's referring to when it's talking about that's its weakness. The spirit is all powerful. It is as powerful as God allows it to be, and God is always allowing. That's why we're having this experience. That's what it talks about. Its weaknesses in the fact that it's bound to the flesh. As for the substance of the psychics, its determination is double. So, in other words, the spirit is pure. Its intention is only light and only gnosis. But the psychic body, which holds both the soul and the physical body, that has two parts. It has a dual nature, the good and the evil. Okay, so the spiritual self is pure, that comes from the Father, the true Father. That gnosis is pure, and its only intention is and motivation is one of truth. And that's it. There's nothing else that governs it but truth. Judgment doesn't govern it, but truth governs it. The psychic body, on the other hand, is something altogether different. It's the soul that entraps the spirit and the body that entraps the soul. It's like layers of sort of like that Chinese doll, Russian doll, you know. You have the spirit within. So in all truth, the most accurate way to say it is that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, meaning a physical experience, but we are spiritual beings. We're not physical beings with spirits, but we are spirits that have physical body. And so this psychic self is very important to understand because it determines the double, since it has the knowledge and the confession of the Exalted One, and it is not inclined to evil because of the inclination of the thought. As for the material substance, its way is different and in many forms, and it was a weakness which existed in many types of inclination. So the dual nature, from which you get the word diablo, it means double, and which you also get the word devil. So the devil is not a specific entity or being, but rather it's a thinking process, and it resides most evidently in the demiurge, and therefore he can be also called the god or the devil of this world. And each one of us, because we also share a part of that demiurge. Those that have the dual nature also have within them the potential to behave as a devil. So we continue. The first human being is a mixed formation and a mixed creation, and a deposit of those of the left and those of the right, and a spiritual word whose attention is divided between each of the two substances from which he takes his being. Therefore, it is said that a paradise was planted for him, so that he might eat of the food of three kinds of tree. And we're going to talk about there are three kinds of trees. So there aren't just two trees, but three in the garden. Here's another Gnostic secret for you. The third tree was hidden from you, and we're going to talk about what that third tree is. Since it is a garden of the threefold order, and since it is that which gives enjoyment. What it's referring to, the first human being, is the first individual who had the potential to have gnosis, or have access to the Christ, which was Adam and Eve, because it was Christ that was the serpent in the garden. And this is all symbolic. It was the first one that offered the knowledge of humankind's origin. When it's talking about a tree, it's referring to the knowledge, trees of knowledge of good and evil. So the Christ took Eve and said, let me tell you the truth of your origin. And Eve right away recognized it to be good, and also right away recognized it to be curious, and she wanted to know. It was within her, a spark already within her to know that, despite the demiurge walking in the garden saying, do not do this, else you'll die. Because, as even Jehovah said, for the day that you do that, not only shall you surely die, but as he later goes on to admit, you'll become like us, knowing good and evil, meaning you'll become as a god, you see, as you were always intended to be. Now, that Christ is the one that is the serpent in the garden. We'll talk about that. It'll become more clear when Christ talks about lifting himself up in the desert as a serpent, and Moses lifting up the serpent in the desert. Those are all subconscious and symbolic renderings of the Christ to come that was in the Old Testament, even though Moses may not have known that, and other beings that followed may not have known that. Christ from afar was set into motion. This is the mingling. This is the first human being. Now, that was of mixed formation. Now, we have to understand this. Prior to that being, there were other beings that carried the light, but they did not understand the fullness of the light because they did not understand evil as well. They only had the light within them, but that was not the full experience that human was to have. Human was to have both the experience of the descension to this realm of the Kenoma, the dark realm. That was one part of the full experience of humankind. The other part, of course, being the Gnostic experience or the Gnosis. But the Gentiles, meaning not of the genetic origin, that group of people, which is everyone but the Israelites or the Jews, they carried only within them gnosis, and they were on an evolutionary path. They were not ready to have the kind of knowledge to go back to the Father. It was first introduced into the lineage of the created Adam and Eve, which were the first of the nation of Israel, and their God was Jehovah. They were the first ones to have access to gnosis, and they bring knowledge to the rest of humanity. And even though they are ignorant of that fact, that's one of the great secrets is it's like, where do you hide something if you really want to hide it? Well, you hide it in plain sight. And that's what essentially occurred. So continuing, and we'll talk about the three trees, and it's become more clear what those are. We already know two of them, of course, is the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. And both of those is Christ. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is the body of Christ, which is the good and evil part. The good part being, of course, the soul that holds the spirit, and then the evil part being the body. And then, of course, the tree of life, which is access to gnosis, which brings eternal life. Now it continues, the noble elect substance which is in him was more exalted. It created, and it did not wound them. So in other words, unbeknownst to the demiurge, he wanted to create beings that would rule over the Gentiles, because he knew that the Gentiles were at a point in their evolutionary path by which they would begin to be able to become industrious and seek out knowledge and become self-aware enough. They'll start to ask questions about their old ways of worshiping God and the Creator God and that way of thinking. They were at the precipice of having gnosis. And so the demiurge, recognizing this, went into a big, quick flurry of wanting to create and fashion someone that would not only obey them, but would rule and be king and queens of the rest of humanity. And that's where he went about to create Adam and Eve. So that's the Jewish, the Israelites, and they rule the planet today, and they'll continue to do so. And that's not going to change, because that's just the nature of the Kanoma. That they are his people. And the only time it will change is when each one of the Jews will find their own gnosis. And they also can find gnosis. In fact, they're the ones that first had gnosis through Eve, basically, in the garden. And so the noble elect substance which is in him was more exalted. So unbeknownst to the demiurge, he could not create Adam and Eve in a way in which he could erase their gnosis. In fact, he knew that they carried the potential to turn that light on. That's why he said, don't take of those trees. He worried that they might, you see. Therefore, they issued a command, making a threat, and bringing upon him a great danger, which is death. Only the enjoyment of the things which are evil did he allow him to taste, and from the other tree with the double fruit. And he did not allow him to eat, much less from the tree of life, so that they would not acquire honor. So this is the third tree that's not being talked about, that the demiurge has been hiding from humanity, and why it was taken out of the Bible. The third tree is the double tree. It's the tree of the physical body of good and evil. It's not the knowledge of, but the experiencing of good and evil. That's the suffering part that leads to death. That way always leads to death. To partake of that fruit, it's to partake of evil, again meaning Eve. That's why her name is Eve. And she was to be created to only partake of that double fruit. But in fact, because of the gnosis in her brought to her by Sophia, she took the tree of knowledge of good and evil instead, unfortunately for the demiurge. But he really wanted to prevent that. He didn't want them to partake of this tree, these two trees, so that they would not acquire honor, them, and so that they would not be, and some missing words here, by the evil power which is called the serpent. And he is more cunning than all the evil powers. He led men astray through the determination of those things which belong to the thought and the desires. He made him transgress the command so that he would die, and he was expelled from every enjoyment of that place. Now, this is not something that you would read normally and consider the serpent to be a benevolent being. This says so that they would not acquire honor in them, so that they would not be. So we don't know what it says here, by the evil power which is called the serpent. So the evil power is the part that divides. And again, when we talk about Christ coming, he was to bring that sword to divide the wheat from the chaff. Not because Christ is judgmental and angry, but rather that Christ is saying that when I come, I know the consequences of me entering into the realm. Consequences of bringing gnosis to this realm is going to be a division. That's what it's talking about when it talks about evil powers. The cunning serpent is knowledgeable. He made him transgress the command so that he would die. and he was expelled from every enjoyment of that place. This is the expulsion which was made for him when he was expelled from the enjoyments of the things which belong to the likeness and those of the representation. It was a work of providence, so that it might be found that it is a short time until man will receive the enjoyment of things which are eternally good, which is the place of rest. So again, this is all set forth purposely. This is the Spirit ordained when he first planned that man should experience the great evil, which is death. That is complete ignorance of the totality. And again, bringing humanity down to the very base level of being completely devoid of gnosis, acknowledgement of gnosis and the totality within them, and thereby being totally empty, so that man would be empty and be able to forge for themselves their own name completely and create their own individual selves back to Rome. This is what this is about. It's not something sinful. It's not something evil in the sense that Orthodox think of it as evil, but the dividing will occur because of the consequences for taking this path. And there's nothing, again, that's intrinsically wretched or beastly or bad or evil about this. This is all purposely set forth because it was what was requested by Sophia from the beginning, which she is wisdom. So it's the wisdom of God in action. But it does not mean, therefore, that that path is not filled with suffering, is not filled with death, and is not filled with sorrow. It indeed is. In fact, it's just because God is the source of everything. To not have connection to God is to be unable to continue and to be in suffering, and to eventually it leads to death. And that he should experience all the evils which come from this, and after the deprivations and cares which are in these, that he should receive the greatest good, which is life eternal, that is, firm knowledge of the totalities. And again, this is what it's being referred to here, is having complete knowledge of the good and evil, which is the body of Christ, which is the blood and the body. You see, that's the knowledge of good and evil, which is so part of the person and the body, physical body person. Because of the transgression of the first man, death ruled. It was accustomed to slay every man in the manifestation of its domination, which had been given it as a kingdom because of the organization of the Father's will, of which we spoke previously. Now, going back to the organization that God the true Father allowed. Now, God the true Father did not create that organization. It was the demiurge that created that hierarchical organization, that one universal order, to have dominion over its kingdom over humanity and the universe, you see. But the Father only allowed it to be, so that's why he willed it. In other words, I will let you do that. If you want that, then do it. So when you think about the true Father, you must understand that that being, the cause of everything, is emanating and allowing for everything to be whatever it wants to be. And that's its essence. But the mystery is that in order for everyone to have complete will, the Father must always be a mystery. Because if you already answer the question of that mystery, then everyone must align up to that definition of existence, and there can be no individual experience and for one to define who they are for themselves. And so the Father is mysterious for that purpose. Therefore, God's name is unspoken, you see. That's why the sacred name of God can never be spoken. It's not that if you say it, if you find out what it is and you say it, then all of a sudden you explode and it's done. But rather that there is no sacred name, purposely. The God of the Father is always expanding, forever infinite, and it cannot be contained in a name, you see, because that is what allows everything to become evermore and evermore. And the closest representation we have of that is Christ, which comes to represent the true Father as being glorious and having no malice, having no hate or revenge or judgment, but completely open and allowing and supporting us, and always trying to provide us gnosis without interfering, but always inviting us to see gnosis around us, to come to our own revelations and epiphanies and moments of truth, so that it doesn't feel force-fed on us, but rather it's always accessible to us, and always reminding us that it's accessible to us, and that's it. And that's all that the Father is doing in terms of intervention, if you want to even call it that. But the demiurge goes about and intervenes in every nick and cranny, a control freak, if you will. But he plays a part. Whether he knows this or not is inconsequential, you see, other than it creates a lot of havoc and a lot of suffering and ultimately death for everyone and recycling, reincarnation. So the helix, the DNA helix, is what is binding the spirit. So that's a crafty creation that demiurge went about to fashion the DNA, because he knows that it would imprison the spirit, and that's what it does. So that's where we are. That's part 2. It's filled with a lot of amazing truths again, as we've already read many other truths in other books. So again, I want to reiterate remind you that having a gnosis or Gnostic moment is not finding one truth and then it's done. It's not that neo moment, that's it. But having gnosis is moments of endless epiphany, moments of endless gnosis, always finding new truths and revealing new parts to God and existence. And you will forever, whether you're in this realm or you're in the pleroma, because in so doing, or having the potential to do so, you will always be on an adventure toward new experiences, infinite experiences that will always blow your mind, so to speak, as they say. It will just always around a new corner, something you never expected. No matter how you could imagine, something beyond your imagination will appear in the infinite totality, because that is the greatness of the true Father in heaven, or in the pleroma. Okay, that's it for now, and we'll pick up in the next video, video number 6, part 3, section 12, called The Variety of the Theologies. And we'll talk about the different approaches of the two orders, and then eventually we'll finish off, probably in video 7 or 8, going into a little more detail about the 3 different types of human beings. And with that, thanks for listening. We'll talk again soon. Bye.